I'm thinking back to the various Ebenezer stones in my life, the moments when I can look back and say, at that point, I know God helped me, God provided, God taught me. One of my favourite memories from a year of travel in Africa is actually a time when God used me to help somebody else. It was March 1993. I'd been staying with my friends in a village outside of Kampala. I'd been there for about 10 days. I was tired. They were excellent days, very full, very busy days, but I was weary. I'd been speaking in churches most days, a lot of talking, a lot of being with people. I'm an introvert. I was feeling tired by this. I also wasn't sleeping well at night. The baby was crying. There were lots of mosquitoes. I was restless. And I had this, I was being challenged, I guess, as I read and thought. I was challenged that I didn't want my faith simply to be expressed through speaking in meetings. I wanted practical ways to love people and care for people, to show compassion. And my prayer was answered in a very unusual way. One afternoon, I was with my friend Bob, and we were travelling with the pastor from the church, and we were walking back to his house. On the way, he wanted us to stop at the house of a woman from the church who was very sick. As we were about to enter her house, we met a young man who was leaving, and he told us that she lived in this house with her sister, and that the sisters were trying to find a vehicle to rent to drive her 300 plus kilometres to her mother's house in the northwest of the country. As Bob and I heard this, we looked at each other and thought, well, maybe we can help. We went inside the house. It was actually a shop where the sisters lived. I'll call them Laura and Joy. Laura was with a healthy sister. She met us at the door, she welcomed us, she took us in, and she told us that Joy, her sister, was seriously sick. She was dying of liver cancer. Joy was lying on a thin foam mattress in the corner of the room. There were several women around her. They were kneeling there beside her. We sat with her for a few moments and prayed. It was a tragic moment. It was a very sad scene. She was very thin, she was frail, she was clearly very, very unwell. As we got up to leave, Laura followed us to the door, and we said to her that we heard she was trying to find a vehicle to take her sister to her mother. And she said yes, and so we said, well, look, we've got a Land Rover, can we help? At that, her eyes filled with tears, and she said, that would be amazing. Bob and I thought, why don't we take her at the weekend? So we said, we could go in 2 or 3 days' time on Saturday. Would that work? And she pulled us a bit further away from the bed, and she said in a quiet voice, I think she's going to die any moment. Can we go immediately? Can we go now? It was already late afternoon, so we looked at each other and nodded. And so we said to Laura, why don't we go in the morning? We'll leave first thing in the morning. So Bob and I and Pastor left the house, and we started walking up the hill. As we were walking up the hill, my friend Bob was staying in the village. I was staying out in the rural area. So I said that I would come in early in the morning. We talked and thought, what happens if she dies on the way? How do we carry a sick woman? We weren't sure. That night, as I went to bed, I went to sleep early, praying, thinking about what would happen in the morning. I woke early at about 5:30. It was dark. I walked 45 minutes into the village along paths that I knew very well in the dark. I arrived just before 6:30 in the morning, and Pastor Salongo was standing outside the building. He'd actually been at an overnight prayer meeting, and he'd stopped at the house on his way back home for breakfast. He met me at the door, and he said sadly that just a few minutes earlier Joy had died. And so Bob and I met outside Laura's house. We went inside. Joy was still lying on the same mattress, except now she'd been covered with a sheet. Women were around the mattress. It was a quiet, sombre, sad atmosphere. Some of the women were quietly crying. I didn't know what to do. I felt an intruder on their grief. I stood quietly in the corner. And then Laura said, can we still take her to my mum? So, what would we do? We thought, how do we take a dead woman 350 kilometres? We talked to Salongo. He suggested, why don't we roll her up in the mattress? Why don't we put her on the roof rack? You can drive into Kampala, buy a coffin, and then drive her up to the northwest of the country. And so that's what we decided to do. I went out to the Land Rover, I found some rope, I found some elastic straps, I went back into the room. I'd never been this close to death before. It was a strange, unnerving, unreal experience. We gently and tried to be respectful. We covered her in a blanket, we rolled her up in the mattress, we rolled a grass mat around her, and then Salongo and I gently tied straps around her. I then carried Joy out to the Land Rover. She hadn't been dead very long. She was thin and tall, but surprisingly heavy, and as I carried her out to the Land Rover, I had this strange thought: what if she doesn't fit on the roof rack? It was hard lifting her up, literally a dead weight, lifting her up to the roof rack. Bob was on the roof rack, and he pulled her up, and we gently tied her. There were jerry cans on the roof rack. We had to put her at an angle across the roof rack. And by about 7:30, we were ready to leave. 4 women were sitting in the back of the Land Rover, Bob and I in the front. We drove into Kampala. It was dawn just starting as we left. We drove into the capital. And on the outskirts of the capital, we came across an area where there was maybe 500 metres of road, where there were coffin makers making coffins and putting their coffins by the road for you to see them as you drove past. We stopped at a coffin maker and we bought a coffin. We put the coffin up on the roof rack and lifted Joy up and put her securely inside the coffin. Then I nailed the lid onto the coffin, and we tied the coffin securely onto the roof rack. We filled the Land Rover up with diesel, and by about 9:30 we were ready to leave. We didn't realise that the 350 kilometres would take us almost 9 hours. It was a difficult road. It was a very poor condition mud road. I was just relieved as we hit the mud and realised that the road was deteriorating. I was so grateful that she had actually died in her own bed. I recognised that if we were driving with a seriously sick woman along this road, almost certainly she would have died. We would then have had her in the Land Rover, not knowing what to do, with her sisters around her, but instead she was on the roof rack in the coffin, and we would at least arrive at the home in a dignified manner. There was a couple of strange incidents as we were driving along. Firstly, a cow suddenly walked across the road, and I had to do an emergency stop, almost hit this cow. And then a few miles further on, as I was driving along, I could hear a strange noise. I looked out of the window and looked down at my front wheel and realised it was wobbling very seriously. We stopped to discover that 4 of the wheel nuts had fallen off the wheel, and there was only 1 wheel nut left, and it was literally on its last thread. We spent half an hour walking back over about a mile or 2 of the road trying to find wheel nuts. We found 1 nut that had fallen off. We took it back. We put it onto the wheel. Fortunately, we had a spare wheel on the back door of the Land Rover with 3 wheel nuts, and so we took the spare wheel off and put it in the back of the vehicle and put those 3 wheel nuts on. It was a miracle. If that final nut had fallen off, we would have suddenly had 3 wheels. We would have hit the ground at a high speed, probably broken the axle. As we started driving, I had this strange thought: what would we have done? We would have been stuck literally in the middle of nowhere with a woman in a coffin on the roof and 4 crying sisters in the back row. What would we have done? As we drove along that terrible road up to Hoima, the women slowly began to talk. It was a sombre, sad atmosphere. They were all tired. They'd been awake all night. They were dejected. They were defeated, but they became more talkative. And as we went through this emotionally intense bonding time, we were actually drawn together. There was a real kind of sense of camaraderie and friendship. The village Kasonga, where the mother was living, was a long-term refugee settlement for refugees from Rwanda. She'd actually had to leave Rwanda in 1959. She'd been a long-term refugee in Uganda ever since. The sisters had all been born refugees in Uganda. They weren't Ugandan citizens. And this camp, 9 hours from Kampala, along an atrocious road, we didn't see electricity, cables, we didn't see phone wires. The mother lived in a very remote area. There was no way of phoning her. She didn't even know that her daughter Joy was sick, let alone that she died. As we approached the settlement, we stopped at another hut first, and Laura jumped out. There was another sister living there. She broke the news to that sister, and then she joined us in the Land Rover, and we carried on. We arrived at a settlement in Kasonga. By this point it was almost dark. A tall, dignified, elderly woman walked out of her hut, saw the sisters climbing out of the Land Rover, and then I watched as her eyes lifted up to the roof of the Land Rover and she saw the coffin on the roof rack. In that moment she must have realised something very strange and sad was happening. The sisters ran to her and they all embraced, and Bob and I hung back, not wanting to intrude on this private moment. But the mother then came and greeted us. She was full of gratitude that we'd brought her daughter home. They escorted us from the Land Rover into the clearing. We sat there, and then after a while we brought the coffin down and took her into a hut. The sisters took her out of the coffin and they began to prepare the body. People began to arrive at the hut, even in the dark. Word seemed to be spreading around the settlement. More and more people were arriving. People were coming up to us, shaking our hands, thanking us. And we were thinking, what have we done? That night, we received amazing hospitality. They prepared a bed for us in a hut. A meal was cooked. In the morning we woke to the sounds of an axe chopping wood. I wondered what was going on, and when I looked outside there were two men and they spent an hour or two cutting pieces of wood and making a rectangular shape. I thought this was something possibly to do with the funeral. And then as I watched I realised they were actually erecting a shelter. They were making a small shower for Bob and I. They heated water on the fire and they gave us a hot shower behind a freshly made shelter. Through the morning, men began to dig a hole outside of the mother's hut. And slowly people began to arrive for the funeral. By lunchtime there were probably 200 people. And in the afternoon they buried Joy just outside the mother's hut. Bob and I were standing there in a crowd of 200 people. It was a very simple funeral, a simple message. The man who was speaking, I remember he said that in the past funerals were rare, but now with war and AIDS, funerals are almost a daily occurrence. Are you ready? It was a simple but powerful message. He then shared, we follow a Lord who said that he is the resurrection and the life, and therefore we do not fear death. And as I looked at the mother and the sisters in their quiet grief, there wasn't fear. There was peace, there was deep sadness. And through that afternoon, as the funeral finished and people began to file away again, they were all shaking our hands. Everybody was full of gratitude for what we had done, and yet it seemed such a small, insignificant thing. One of the men laid 2 banana leaves down on the ground, and as people left, they put small offerings of money on the banana leaves. 9,000 shillings was given that afternoon to help the mother with the funeral expenses. Initially, Bob and I had imagined we would drop the sisters off at the house and then return home. We didn't realise how long the drive was. It was obvious we were going to spend the night. And on the second day, we were thinking maybe we should leave. But the sisters wanted a ride back to the capital. And so we figured the best thing is to stay a couple of nights. So we ended up staying 2 nights. And that day passed with the funeral. In the evening, just the family were left and they stayed together with us, telling stories about Joy's life. They cooked cassava and chicken. And the mother, who spoke no English, smiled, constantly shook our hands. And we could tell that in this place of grief, there was a deep sense of gratitude that her daughter had been brought back to her. And I know that in many parts of Africa, it's important that people are buried in the place of their land. It's important that they're buried where their ancestors dwell, and that was true in this case. There was something significant about her, a refugee being buried where her mother lived. The following day, we drove back to the capital and back to the village. We arrived at Laura's shop late in the afternoon, and she said, "Will you come in for a cup of tea?" So we went into the house. It just so happened that the church were finishing an open air at the prison just as we arrived, and within 10 minutes people began to arrive at the door. People entered the house, Very quickly there were 40 people crowded into the shop. People started singing, and suddenly there was a celebration, a time of worship there in the shop. And again, more and more people were coming up to us and shaking our hands. One person said, "Never have Mzungu carried our dead bodies around like this. Now we know that you love us." We went back late that night to Salonga's house. And as I prepared to go to sleep that night, I thought about the mother, a refugee, living in a country that wasn't her country, in exile, longing for home, her daughters living in another part of the country. And somehow, God, in his mercy, in his care for the widow and the orphan and the refugee, it was significant that Joy was brought back to be buried at her mother's land. And God used us. And in that moment, I was so grateful. I was so grateful that I'd had the opportunity to play this part. And I was also so grateful that in the split moment when Bob and I first walked into the house, we reacted with compassion. We could have thought, no, it's too far. We could have thought, that'll cost a fortune in fuel. We could have reacted from a hard place. Thankfully, we reacted with compassion. And because of that, we were able to take part in something. And as I looked back on this strange weekend, I realised it was actually one of the most special moments of my whole year. In recognising God's individual care for this Rwandese refugee and the fact that God can use me in the strangest of times to be a blessing to other people.